Some of the fire behaviour we're seeing is some things we've never seen before.
This wasn't an ordinary fire. This was a climate change disaster and a tornado.
And they couldn't stop it. They just get out of control.
I was seriously worried for my life. It doesn't get any bigger wake-up call than this.
What's happening here in Australia is really a warning to all of us.
Australia will never be the same after this.
We've been going this non-stop for 5.5 months. We have not had a break. We started early on the northern part of the state, but it never stopped.
A summer of fire and ash haunts Australia.
We ended up really with all the areas of the state alight all at once. We've burnt a record amount.
The scope of damage from hundreds of massive brush fires is staggering.
34 lives, 46 million acres,
1 billion animals. Hundreds of firefighters hurt. Close to 3,000 homes incinerated.
I think we had over 1,000 lost on one day, and that's on New Year's Eve.
57% of people here have been directly affected by the fires or the smoke. Recent heavy rains have helped immensely,
and the fires are finally out.
Because we're in a drought and the landscape's so dry, these fires are taking hold and proving really difficult to put out.
Bushfires are a part of the fabric of life here.
For about 6 months around the summertime, we see a mix of severe weather. We get extreme heat waves, we get bushfires, we get tropical cyclones every single year.
But not like this.
We're seeing these events that we've never seen before, so it's therefore really hard to control them because we don't really know how.
Unprecedented is the word people keep using.
It's unprecedented.
It's completely unprecedented, completely out of the blue.
I've been photographing fires for about 25 years. Places you would normally consider safety zones and areas you could get out of, or areas where the fire behaviour shouldn't be that bad, the fires were tearing through there.
It was very hot and it was very dry for a really long period of time before the fires started.
Officially, it was the warmest and driest year on record, and those records go back to the early 1900s, and that's for the country as a whole. We had such little rain and such high temperatures that exacerbated that bushfire fuel, and that's why we saw such bad bushfires at the end of the year.
Heat and drought conditions in Southeast Australia are often the product of natural weather patterns.
We saw two strong climate drivers affecting Australia. One of them was a positive Indian Ocean dipole, which is basically a pattern of sea surface temperatures in the Indian Ocean that causes above average temperature and below average rain in Australia.
This positive dipole was the strongest in 20 years.
We also had a negative southern annular mode at the end of the year. Basically that caused windier than usual conditions and drier than usual conditions in New South Wales.
But then also we've actually warmed by 1 degree Celsius. So it was all those things coming together in, I guess, the perfect storm of events that really made this summer so extreme.
But these temperatures and winds and drought were amplified by a third distressing factor.
Hello, we have serious climate change going on here.
Scientists have been ringing the alarm on climate change for decades. One of the loudest modern-day voices is Dr. Michael Mann, an American climatologist, professor, and author. Mann just happened to be in Sydney on sabbatical during the record-breaking wildfire season.
It's pretty easy to connect the dots on this one. Again, we would not have been seeing such widespread, intense, and fast-spreading fires if it were not for the dryness and the heat due to human-caused climate change.
Why should someone watching this in the United States, in South Florida, care about what's happening thousands of miles away in Australia?
Well, what's happening here in Australia is really a warning to all of us. Pretty soon, we are going to see the same sorts of unprecedented events.
Climate change is clearly one of the key things that drives fire and fire behaviour. How do we know these things? Because we can read English. It's been documented time after time after time, and now the science has developed to the stage where we can actually start to pin individual fire events to actual changes in climate.
Here, the triggers of fire's fury descend from the sky.
The fires we've had are overwhelmingly lightning strike fires that have caused a lot of destruction this year.
And when we have dry lightning strikes, then we have more ignition points and we have more issues to do with fire.
They weren't able to stop the ignitions. They were just, lightning strike would start something up and they just couldn't stop it.
Often it's a vicious and merciless cycle. As lightning sparks fire, fires can in turn create lightning.
Fires get so big, they start creating their own lightning and their own wind.
The huge plumes of smoke cool as they rise into the atmosphere. Then they form clouds that can cause thunderstorms. New fires spark, winds whip, often overwhelming anything in its path. Firefighters sometimes lucky to escape. As fires give rise to more fire, climate change amplifies even more climate change. It's called the carbon feedback loop.
That carbon that we've been putting out of the atmosphere is now being released back into the atmosphere in terms of smoke, but it continues because the dead trees that come down, they will rot over the next 10 years and they're still releasing carbon.
They have now, in a period of a couple months, put as much carbon into the atmosphere because of these bushfires than they had put into the atmosphere from the last year.
Vibrant forests reduced to pools of soot. Many of the trees here are resilient to fire, but not these climate-amplified infernos.
These fires, being unusually hot and large scale, may mean the usual ways of forest regenerating don't exist, which then means that we don't get that big flush of regrowth, which would start to suck the carbon back in.
Some areas have been burnt 3 or 4 times in 25 years. So the frequency of fire and the interval between fire is changed, and if we don't manage that, we will lose those ecosystems because they simply can't have long enough to recover before they get smashed again. We're seeing fires in places that really shouldn't burn, such as the subtropical rainforest.
The fire frequency is increasing, the size of the fires is increasing, they're becoming earlier.
Our fire season now can be like 8 months long. It's not just 3 months of summer. And if that certainly is the new norm for us, then we have to have a good think about what that looks like for us going forward.
So the fires that we have just experienced now occurred under 1 degree of global warming. So what can we expect in 20 or 30 years' time? What will these fires be like then?
Climate change is a global disease. Wildfires are just one symptom. Florida is no stranger to fire, but large-scale blazes are mitigated by controlled burns and built-in humidity. Here, the threat of climate change is not a song of fire, but of water.
We're the tip of the spear. One of the biggest impacts of climate change is sea level rise. And most people here in South Florida live at about sea level and near the sea.
If you're in southern Florida, if you've experienced flooding from these king tides, they inundate the streets of Miami Beach and Fort Lauderdale. Add on these intense hurricanes and the storm surge from those events, pretty soon you're talking about large parts of the coast of Florida becoming uninsurable.
Sea levels are projected to rise between 8 and 14 inches over the next 10 years, between 1 foot and 2 feet in 20 years, and as much as 3 feet by 2060.
We may see sea level rise in this century that could put 4 to 13 million Americans underwater permanently. It may not be possible in all places to keep that water out.
And it's those numbers that are forcing many shoreline communities to do the unthinkable: retreat.
5 years ago, when I started thinking about retreat, it was considered a far-off future option. That has rapidly changed as different local governments, different states are thinking about how to manage flood risk into the future.
Regardless of where you are now, whether it's Florida, whether it's here in Australia, the impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. We're seeing them play out in real time now, and we're already seeing the threat that they pose to us and our environment.
Whether it's fire or water, climate change is Earth's most formidable threat. The lessons of Australia echoing across the globe for those willing to listen.
I think this is an example of what some parts of the world can expect in the future.
Are we dealing with a new normal? No, it actually is worse than that. It's an ever worsening sliding baseline of climate change impacts if we fail to act.
Considering that we've only just warmed by 1 degree and we're really starting to see these huge impacts now, what's going to happen on a 3-degree world.
And that's sort of a cautionary tale for the rest of us. If we continue to warm the planet, larger and larger regions of the United States and Europe and everywhere else will become uninhabitable to human beings, essentially.
My plea to the rest of the world is don't go down this path. If we just ignore it, it'll go away and we will go away with it.
Amid the unprecedented devastation in Australia, an unfathomable catastrophe.
We're talking about not thousands of animals, not hundreds of thousands of animals, not millions, but billions of native animals lost.
A wildlife disaster.
So you've got this beautiful ecology in Australia that's just millions of years old, and it remains to be seen just exactly what that is going to do for our sense of identity in Australia.
That identity is most commonly defined with two iconic species, the kangaroo and the koala. Both of their populations have been devastated. 30,000 kangaroo and 50,000 koala are estimated dead just on Kangaroo Island, a celebrated animal sanctuary.
It was a horrible thing. We lost 75% of the population of our wildlife. It's been vaporised. It's Vietnam.
They were infernos. It's amazing that some have survived, but they have, and we're going to do our best to get them back to full health.
Similar scenes throughout the country.
It's devastating, obviously, and to see it en masse like that, it is quite dire.
New Year's Eve blazes ripped across the south coast, including in Mogo.
So the wraparound veranda went all the way around.
Ray Harvey runs Wild to Free Kangaroo Sanctuary here.
That's the fire break into Mogo.
She was forced to flee by boat and watch this peninsula burn.
You have kangaroos that obviously depend on you to a certain extent. What was that like, being out there and looking back at that?
I thought they were all going to be dead, every single one.
But there were survivors, and Harvey is again taking care of them.
This is Honey. She's in critical condition and we can't treat her just yet. We've lost about 2/3 of the population here, and we have some that are injured, and we have some that are perfectly fine. This is Cricket. We've been able to give her some much needed antibiotics today. My job right now is to stay here and keep everything as normal as possible to maintain their calmness. So I just act like everything's completely normal around here.
We've got a big mess to clean up today, haven't we? Look at the mess you guys made.
I'm only here for them. It'd be easy to walk away from all this and go and live in a nice capital city where it's safe and I've got all of my conveniences and a nice little house. So it's my job, and many other wildlife carers down here feel it's their responsibility to keep them alive.
The fires have pressed other wildlife experts into emergency action. A dozen koala were rescued from the Blue Mountains and brought here, the Taronga Zoo in Sydney.
The fire was moving quite quickly towards them, and then thankfully it shifted and enabled access into the national park to save them.
They were found by a radio transmitter tagged on one of the animal's ears, and now cared for around the clock until they can safely be released back into the wild.
Those animals who were lucky enough to survive the fire face another potentially deadly threat, the almost total loss of their food supply.
Koala lives in eucalyptus trees and it feeds on the leaves from those trees. So while they're burnt, that means that their habitat is limited and the food is even worse.
Koala also face the threat of development. They simply have less land to choose from, causing a population bottleneck.
And so then when a fire goes through, instead of taking a small portion of a population out, it takes a large number out.
But the ultimate threat to both of these species lies with the planet's biggest challenge.
This wasn't an ordinary fire. This was a climate change disaster and a tornado.
What does climate change look like for the koala population? What happens down the road if things are
Look, I mean, if things keep going on the track that they are, it doesn't look great. Drought for a koala isn't great. It means that they need to access lower lying trees in gullies and things, so it restricts their habitat quite significantly.
Over the years, every plant and animal has adapted to its environment. And if it slowly changes, they will also slowly adapt to it. It's when they quickly change, then they don't have time to adapt, and you could lose species just like that.
We've seen animals that are already extinct as a consequence of the change in climate.
Plants and animals used to think spring was safe. It was wet, lots of food around. That's when you build your nests and have your babies and what have you. Babies can't cope with fire. Fire comes into spring, suddenly the entire population disappears. That entire generation is burnt out.
Kangaroos and koalas like this one exist nowhere else in the world. If the devastation to their population continues, they move dangerously close to extinction.
The vast majority of biodiversity in Australia occurs nowhere else. So that means that Australia has an enormous custodial role to protect the biodiversity that's here. Not only for the nation itself, but for the rest of the planet.
What is the value of biodiversity?
Most critically for humans, biodiversity is the fundamental driver of how ecosystems work. So that means that biodiversity is important for pollinating our crops, dispersing seeds of trees, influencing how ecosystems grow. If those ecosystems don't function, then humanity is massively challenged.
Is extinction a real possibility for these animals if climate change goes unchecked?
So Australia leads the world in mammal extinctions. A classic example is this wonderful animal called the greater glider. It's, for all intents and purposes, a small gliding koala, but very sensitive to climate change, very sensitive to fire, and very sensitive to logging. And that animal is in lots and lots of trouble.
The koala before drought, before the fires, was already a species at challenge. There was a potential that koala could become extinct in the next 30 years. These bushfires have really just elevated that.
What you see in Australia now is a result of extreme climate changes. Extreme heat, which has led to drought, which has led to these horrific fires.
Ron McGill has dedicated a lifetime to animals, and he sees a growing threat of climate change to our native species.
We could lose in the next 50 years over 1 million species of animals, over 1 million species of animals, primarily associated with climate change. South Florida is actually a mirror of that. When you look at it, South Florida is really ground zero in the United States when it comes to climate change and what climate change can do to this incredible place that we live in.
While the animals of Australia face the danger from fire, the biggest threat to our wildlife stems from water.
Sea level rise. This is something that's probably the single most catastrophic potential here in the state of Florida. 1 foot sea level rise will wipe out half of the habitat for most of the animals that live in the Everglades. The key deer. Here's an animal that lives basically on a key that is only a few feet above sea level. 1 foot rise in sea level could wipe out the entire population of key deer. The manatee, with the warming of the oceans, you've got algae blooms, you've got red tide. Red tide causes a type of toxin that was found to kill almost 200 manatees a couple of years ago. We are directly connected. Look at Australia. It could be the canary in the coal mine of what could happen here in South Florida. When it comes to fires, when it comes to hurricanes, when it comes to droughts, all those things have catastrophic effects and are in the future for us if things don't change.
What can the rest of the world learn about what you guys have gone through with this?
Well, don't take things for granted, that's for sure. And habitat preservation is just so important.
There needs to be a change in value system. We need to value these amazing animals and biosphere around us, because you see what happens when you get some things out of order.
This is not fake news. This is science. And people need to understand how important it is, if not for themselves, for their kids and their kids after that.
Protect your animals. Don't let progress get in the way of nature. Nature's really important, and protect it with everything that you've got. Because this was called the Nature Coast. Now it's gone. Don't let yours go. Because we've lost ours. And I'm heartbroken.
The images are shocking. Australia set ablaze on an unprecedented scale. The collision of the country's most extreme drought and its most extreme temperatures.
So extreme heat in itself is a really underestimated risk to us. The fires are really easy to see how dangerous they are. The extreme heat is Australia's deadliest natural disaster.
Record temperatures pose many direct threats to human health and the environment here, but it has also fueled a crisis in the ocean.
It has impacts on our ecosystems, things like our Great Barrier Reef, a lot of our marine wildlife is quite vulnerable to that heat.
The Great Barrier Reef is an Australian icon, one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. It's the world's largest coral reef, equal in size to Japan. So massive, it's visible from space. 2 million visitors come to this reef each year, generating $6.5 billion for the Australian economy. It's fused to the identity here. And it's dying.
The health of the Great Barrier Reef is actually not so good. In 2016 and 2017 we had very severe heat waves, so back-to-back heat waves in those 2 years. And over the course of the 2 years we lost about half of all the coral present on the Great Barrier Reef.
As its name implies, it's also a protector for the mainland and a source of life for its people.
Almost the only food that some people can obtain is from the reef to feed their families and for their economies as well. Nearly 30% of all marine species live on coral reefs. There's a long list of benefits that coral reefs bring to humans.
But climate change is slowly devouring the reef.
With climate warming we see a gradual increase in temperature that can cause stress, but then also we see an increased frequency, intensity and duration of these summer heat waves that are the biggest threat to coral reefs at the moment.
As the temperatures increase, the oceans heat. Warmer waters causes corals to stress and could cause a mass die-off known as bleaching.
If a reef goes through a mass bleaching event, then almost all corals on the reef will pale.
Corals lose the algae that lives inside their tissue and gives them their color.
And then if they cannot re-establish that relationship with the algae, they will die. So you see quite a colorless reef.
And that bleaching is usually followed by the loss of fish and other species that rely on the reef. An entire ecosystem could collapse. Australia has already warmed by 1 degree Celsius. The waters of the reef have warmed even more. 2/3 of the reef have seen sea surface temperatures rise between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius above normal.
And now, the reef is seeing a 3rd mass bleaching in the last 5 years.
Doesn't really look good. I think we will continue to see a decline in coral reef, in coral cover, coral reef health.
Bleaching events can happen quickly. Reef recovery is much slower.
It probably takes between 10 and 20 years for a reef to recover from a severe disturbance. And the problem now is that those major disturbances occur at a much higher frequency, so there's not enough time for the reefs to recover fully.
Van Oppen is leading research to jumpstart this recovery, giving evolution an assist.
So we use selective breeding. We are trying to develop methods to improve basically heat tolerance of corals. And we've had some very promising early results.
Professor Van Oppen tells us her research gives her hope for the future of coral reefs, but stresses the need for climate change action if we want to save our reefs for future generations.
Ultimately, we have to do something about climate change, climate warming, because if we don't address that in the long term, the reef will continue to decline.
And that is a threat that really hits home. Over the last 30 years, the world has lost half of the ocean's corals, and Florida has not been spared.
I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The state of the Florida Reef Tract is dire. We are losing corals at an unprecedented rate.
I would suggest that for the first time in human history, we are witnessing potentially the loss of an ecosystem.
The parallels are uncanny.
We've had episodes of climate change related bleaching episodes that have caused corals to die off. We've had generally poor water quality that has promoted the growth of seaweeds instead of corals.
But Florida's reeling reefs have the insult of another climate change fueled culprit to contend with: stony coral tissue loss disease.
What's unusual about this disease, it's probably the worst coral disease outbreak that's ever been recorded anywhere in the world. This is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. This is the last kind of thing in a series of events that have happened for Florida's reefs.
Like Australia, our reefs are our protectors and our providers.
Reefs are the rainforest of the oceans. They're also a huge economic engine for us. Tourism, people come here to fish, to go diving, to go snorkeling. All of that can be catastrophically wiped out just by 1 or 2 degree rise in temperature.
They actually protect our coastlines from storms. And in a situation in Miami where everybody's worried about sea level rise, everybody's worried about storm surge, people in Miami Beach are particularly worried about coastal inundation, here's a situation where the natural resources are actually helping protect us from those threats, and yet we're not taking the necessary measures to protect them from the threats that we ourselves are creating.
Like the Great Barrier Reef, our tract is part of our identity.
Without the reefs, we don't have anything in the Keys. The reefs are everything. They're what the economy is based on. It's what people's livelihoods are based on. It's what, people's social lives and memories and experiences are based on. And without the coral, no one's going to have those memories in the future.
Each year, reefs generate an estimated $4.5 billion locally and account for 70,000 jobs.
Unless you value your economy, your environment, you're not going to have it available to be sustainable in the future. And so all of those things that we take for granted that sustain our essentially tourist economy are going to be lost.
Like Dr. Van Oppen, researchers here in Florida are trying their own assisted evolution approach, working year-round to rescue and recover our reefs.
So what we've started doing is with our corals that we grow in nurseries, we collect the spawn in the nursery, we bring it on land, we do the fertilization ourselves, we rear the larvae, we settle them, and then we put them back in the nursery and outplant them.
The efforts are showing promise. Thousands of corals are being saved and replanted. But if the oceans keep warming at unprecedented rates, it may not matter.
I'm hoping that what's happening in Australia is a wake-up call to people, not just here, but around the world.
For our kids, our grandkids, we'd like them to know what a coral reef is outside of a book. We are losing an ecosystem on our watch, and we just can't allow that to happen.
What does the future look like for corals if we do absolutely nothing as far as climate action goes?
Curbing climate warming is critically important to try and save coral reefs. If we don't achieve that, there's very little hope for coral reefs.
The massive fires in Australia may be under control, but anger from the summer still simmers.
Tell the truth!
A scorched countryside and an ecological disaster, rallying thousands to march on all of the capital cities. The masses blasting the lack of action on the worsening climate crisis and demanding change.
The youth are rising! No more compromising!
But the conservative political leadership here continues to downplay the threat of climate change.
We cannot control the natural disaster, but what we can do is control our response.
We've been talking about these issues about climate change and extreme events and what the future's going to be looking like for decades, for longer than I've been researching, or maybe even longer than I've been alive, and it seems like it's falling on deaf ears. I find that really frustrating, and it's kind of heartbreaking to see that they're still not taking it seriously.
Australians are quite divided on climate change. I think it's been made political, particularly by lobby groups that have either lobby for keeping things as they are, business as usual, but also groups that sow a lot of doubt about whether climate change is even real.
Our own Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, doesn't want to go because he doesn't care about the beautiful place we call home.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison has been the target of much of the criticism.
You're not welcome!
I understand the very strong feelings people have. They've lost everything.
I think that recently there has been a lot of criticism of the Prime Minister for not taking leadership, and he went on holiday during one of the crucial times for the fires. And I think people link that rightly or wrongly to him perhaps not caring about what's happening with climate change.
In Australia, which historically has not been aligned with those sort of climate change denying petrostates, finds itself currently with a prime minister who denies that climate change is real and has done everything to actually block progress in acting on climate.
They're coming halfway to the table. They're admitting that there's a problem, but they're still refusing to fix the long-term solution.
A lot of it comes down to, but the economy.
The economy and coal, that's what it comes down to. Oh, we'll lose too many jobs.
Coal is a pillar of the Australian economy. It's mined in every state in the country, more than 500 million tons of it in 2018. And Australia is the world's largest exporter, raking in $46 billion. Coal supplies almost a quarter of the world's primary energy, but it's burned to do so, and as a result, generates 40% of the fossil fuel emissions around the globe.
The coal emissions, the industrialisation of coal production is a problem. It is definitely adding to the overall atmospheric carbon load.
Coal and serious climate change action simply cannot coexist.
The division really is today about the climate change versus the economy.
This is coal. Don't be afraid.
The
Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal.
Fossil fuels are a really important part of our economies, and so that really does affect the politics. So they're often walking this sort of tightrope between listening to people's concern, but also thinking about, am I doing the right thing for the economy?
Mr. Speaker, those opposite have an ideological, pathological fear of coal.
But the longer Australia's economy relies on coal production, the worse it makes its own climate crisis. Some estimate that the cost of climate change will near $27 billion annually by 2050, the same as the country's defense budget currently.
The impacts of climate change that we're seeing because we haven't acted sufficiently is already far greater than the cost of action.
In Canberra, we've had huge disruptions just because of the smoke. Businesses were closed for days on end. It affected people's health. I don't think it's an option for us to not do anything.
With so much money at stake, there's plenty of sources helping fuel climate disinformation.
Sometimes, the media's a bit divided. Some newspaper groups are sort of saying, even questioning whether climate change exists, because it means for many that things are going to have to change. Those things are actually dangerous because ultimately you're not protecting the population of your country.
Climate change denialism was on full display during these blazes. Arson falsely being played up as the main instigator.
These things have sort of been fact-checked since and shown to be, quite exaggerated.
It's really lightning strikes.
What do you think the rest of the world should learn from what's happened to you guys here in Australia?
Climate change is real. Everybody that's denying it stands to make a profit from it. Isn't that obvious?
Australians can be very stubborn. It's really the education of the Australian public.
We listen to experts for almost anything else, right? When our car breaks down, we go to an expert to have it fixed. When we are sick, we go to a doctor who's trained. So why not believe the experts when it comes to climate change?
But there are growing signs the conversation may be substantially changing.
There's a level of awareness about climate change that I think is unprecedented.
People are starting to wake up a bit more.
The whole period that we've just encountered the last 2 months in Australia is against a backdrop of this politicisation of the science and debate about whether climate change played a role. And while that's happening, people are losing their homes. And one positive of this, I think, is people just moving on and making progress, taking action into their own hands and really showing what can be done in the absence of political leadership.
The type of heat and the type of fires that we saw in Australia are starting to change people's minds that may have been undecided about climate change or didn't believe in climate change. I think there's still a long way to go.
Australia will never be the same after this. I have never seen such a strong response from so many people over such a prolonged period. That's people wanting something to happen on climate change, from the media to the average person in the street.
This may be a turning point for them. This may be a tipping point where the impacts have become so pervasive, these almost apocalyptic wildfires. It sort of raised awareness in Australia here.
Skeptics are getting less airtime. It seems to be that, people at least noticing that something's not right.
Right here, right now, is where we draw the line.
And the political landscape of climate change isn't only changing in Australia.
Climate change is here, it's real. We have to mitigate for it, meaning we have to stop polluting the atmosphere with carbon dioxide emissions. And we also have to start adapting.
The conversation is changing here in South Florida too, and across the country.
The conversation is changing rapidly. When I got to Congress in 2015, Republicans did not even want to utter those words, climate and change, together. Today, Republicans are starting to take this seriously, and that's good news for anyone who wants to get this solved. Two big factors. Number one, the science. Every day it's more compelling. Every day this is less of a debate. And then the other thing that has changed are the politics. This young generation of millennials that are starting to register to vote, they all want to see the government address climate change and the environment in a meaningful way. Republicans are starting to feel that pressure and they're starting to react. We have to understand it's not going to be solved overnight, and we have to celebrate every step of progress along the way.
But not everyone is as optimistic. The United States is withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. and rolling back many climate regulations.
Unfortunately, the current administration has shown no interest in acting on climate change or even in working with our international partners to solve this problem. Instead, Trump has filled his administration with fossil fuel and energy lobbyists.
Well, the president has certainly used rhetoric that contradicts, counters any effort to meaningfully address carbon pollution. Even the most prominent denialist, which has been the president, is starting to evolve on this issue. He got behind an initiative to plant 1 trillion trees around the world. We all need to create a political environment that encourages both sides to meet in the middle and start making some real significant progress in this space.
We need the United States and Australia and all of the players to come to the table. At some point we have to ask, what is it going to take to finally get our policymakers to do something about this problem? How bad are we willing to let it get?
This is probably the biggest challenge that humanity has ever faced. This is not a political issue, this is a human issue, and we all have to solve it.
I am standing here a traveller from a new reality, a burning Australia, where amidst the endless falling ash, the thing that is clearest to see is that what was feared and what was warned is no longer in our future a topic for debate. It is here. We have seen the unfolding wings of climate change.
After 6 months, the fires are finally out in Australia.
Total devastation.
But the recovery is just beginning. 46 million acres of damage, and the concern for the future grows. How does it make you feel to look out and see this and think that this is yours, this is your property,
Well,
we're standing on your...
I've been thinking to myself, I'm a bushfire victim, Angie, but after a while, I started to get a realisation a couple of days ago. I thought, no, I'm not. I'm a victim of climate change. And I really believe that, because things are just getting out of hand.
Michael Green is a resident of Dargan, a city in the iconic Blue Mountains here. He lost his home of 22 years to the massive blazes last month.
I think we have to really start looking at what we're doing. The world needs a wake-up call. There's definitely something happening, and I don't care if people deny it. They say there's no climate change. But, you know, there's too much happening. In too many places, too many records being broken.
It's not close to home in America. Why should they care, seeing what you guys are going through?
I would say to them is that don't think it can't happen to you, no matter where you are. Sooner or later, it's going to affect us all, if it keeps going the way it's going.
And to face what this new reality brings, we need leaders to match this moment. To lead is to guide, to have a vision for the way ahead. That is impossible if you deny where we are heading.
You have to wonder, where's the tipping point when the average
We're
person...
past it. We're past the tipping point.
I'm right. Come around the back, mate. Come around the back. Come around the back.
It's going to take the Australians to fix this one.
Want to get on the grass here, mate? Where are you heading, buddy?
Ignorance is not going to be the way forward.
Can we get him in the crop?
It doesn't get any bigger wake-up call than this.
As more and more Australians agree on the problem, finding solutions won't be easy.
There are things we can do, and they're not going to be cheap.
It's fairly clear, if we want to avert catastrophic warming of the planet, we need to bring our carbon emissions down dramatically over the next 10 years. We can't wait.
And action looks like what?
Action means getting off fossil fuels, politicians, our policymakers, making sure there are incentives for people to engage in carbon-friendly behaviors.
We need to
to have ambitious targets for reducing carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions. This is the only viable long-term strategy for protecting our planet and protecting public health.
There's a worthy debate to be had about how we do this, but we need a price on carbon so that we incentivize this massive shift that we need away from our reliance on fossil fuels towards clean, renewable energy.
What we also have an abundance of is a lot of wind and a lot of sunshine. So we could actually be a renewable superpower in Australia.
The exciting thing about that is that it creates enormous opportunities for employment, for growth, for new industries. And that's the new economy. We need to leave the old economy behind because look where it's got us.
Addressing climate change is equal parts mitigation and adaptation. Australia has already warmed by 1 degree. More warming is already locked in, but just how much is uncertain.
The future is not good, and I hate to think what Australia and large parts of the rest of the world will be like with another 4 to 6 degrees of extra temperature. You know, that will make significant parts of the globe unlivable for the vast majority of people.
Particularly in Australia, we've had the bushfires that have been coupled with really bad smoke. Can people go to work? Can the postal service run? We really will have to reconsider, you know, anything and everything, but we will see more of them, and I think that's the scary thing. If we see fires of this ferocity occur more often, we probably won't have time to adapt.
As Australia faces the reality of a reoccurrence of these extreme fires, Florida will soon brace for the reality of a new hurricane season. Recent storms so record-breaking that researchers are considering adding an unprecedented Category 6.
No one is going to escape these effects.
We need to make sure we reduce carbon pollution and adapt our communities, invest in the infrastructure that we need if we're going to continue living in parts of the country like Miami.
But economics are at play here too. Will Florida and the rest of the country accept a move away from fossil fuels and the billions of dollars at play?
We have to be realistic. Some people think that by the year 2030, we can be an all renewables economy. That's just not realistic. It's going to take everything. We're going to have to make investments in renewable technologies, in carbon capture, in technologies that we can't even imagine today that will help us address this. So I'm worried, but I'm also hopeful.
Can humans adapt to this?
Well, humans have got to adapt, otherwise I hate to think what the future is going to be like. These things drive at the fundamental core of human society and how we function as a species on the planet.
If nothing changes, then what?
It's going to be a very difficult world for our children to live in, and their children in particular. Maybe they'll get used to it. I really hope they're not used to the fact that their skies are constantly shrouded in smoke. But that's kind of the world that we're staring down the barrel of.
This world has already changed. It is unutterably altered. And that momentous shift will continue. There is what we do not know. And then there is what we come to know. And it's what we do next that makes the difference.